Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And we've been doing a lot of conversations lately about the Alexander Technique concept of inhibition. And I had a kind of an insight, perhaps. I don't know if it's how well it'll
wild idea.
Wild idea, yeah. That is kind of based, kind of came to me when I was thinking about inhibition and how one can accomplish it. And I'd like to begin with talking a little bit about the car driver and their car analogy to human functioning. I like that analogy. So that analogy,
yeah,
the person driving the car is doing the controlling, using their arms and their brain and stuff, and they are making the decisions about what the car is going to do. And the car, it's designed to just follow those instructions. It doesn't really typically have a mind of its own. Now, there is this whole thing now about driverless cars that muddies it a bit.
Let's not get into that.
But we don't want to get into that because I don't think it fundamentally changes what we're going to talk about. And it's an interesting analogy. And if you're trying to explain the Alexander technique to someone who has no experience with it, it can be very helpful. Your brain, especially your prefrontal cortex, should be hopefully in charge of what's going on. And it delivers the message, and the rest of you figures out what to do about that. The driver gets in the car, he's made a decision about where he or she wants to go, and the car does it, right? The car just follows the commands.
Yeah, I can see how it kind of generally works. And I can also see how you could say that the environment that the car is in has an impact, not just the driver, if it's on an old gravel road.
Okay, sure,
and so
right.
And how well it's looked after.
Of course. Yeah. But at any one moment, the driver's kind of in charge to a large extent. But the analogy, it breaks down at a certain point, because unlike the driver in the car, your conscious brain and the rest of you are intimately wired together in many, many ways. And
we're not separate.
We're not separate. But it's a nice analogy for a simple description of the technique. It can be. But that the fact that it doesn't really hold at the more profound level, that you could, to get back to our earlier talks about inhibition and what you do to, how does one inhibit, you're basically, your mind is saying, this is what I want, and then the rest of you fulfills that command, and your conscious mind's job is to stay out of the way. It's a little different with a car, because yes, you control what it does, but if something goes amiss, like say you're having trouble starting the car in the morning, or it doesn't seem like you're getting good acceleration, or maybe you get a sense the alignment of the car is off a little bit, you're having to steer in an awkward way. You can't just think my car is functioning perfectly. That won't work. So you have to, depending, I mean, if you're an auto mechanic or if you're a car buff, you could go and take it to your own personal garage in your home and fix it. But most of us would outsource that job to somebody else. A car mechanic would be a good choice, right? And you say to them, these are the symptoms I notice. And the mechanic will if it's any kind of car in the last, I guess, 20, 25 years or so, we'll put the scanner on it and get all kinds of information. And, or maybe just from what you say, they'll be able to figure it out. And they go and fix it. And if it, for example, if they find that a certain part is broken or not working properly, they go in there, they take out the old one and put in a new one, and the car's good to go, right? They've taken care of it. It may be a complex bit of analysis they have to do if it's tricky, but ultimately they're usually able to do that for you. You can outsource that whole task to somebody else. You take the car in and they call you back a day later and says, we found it and here's what we need to do and here's what it's going to cost. And you say, yep, go ahead. And then you go and get the car and it's as good as new. Right? That's kind of the process.
You hope, yeah.
You hope. Yeah. But that is kind of the basic process.
Yeah.
You need, cars are complicated these days, and you probably need a certain amount of expertise and specialized equipment on the part of the mechanic, but it's an outsourcing process. And earlier, I raised the question of, well, is inhibition, that is, thinking a thought about ourselves, but getting out, but not actually implementing it, is a kind of outsourcing as well. But it has a different set of dimensions to it than the car situation. Because in the car, you have various parts that operate together in a very fixed way, and you can change one and it doesn't have to reset everything else. But we're not that way. Everything is connected with everything. And it's not just like a cliche. It really is the case.
Yeah, and it struck me just as what you wrote to me before the interview, just a few words on this. How it's really hard to talk about because our language creates a separation that isn't there, but we sort of need to talk about the things separately to understand.
Oh, yeah.
But it's actually all
it's mixed
it's all
up.
One experience.
It's all one thing. And that leads to a basic distinction between the kind of outsourcing you might do with your car, where you turn it over to another person who is more of an expert in cars. You can outsource it to them, and while they're taking care of it, you can be doing whatever you want. You don't have to give any thought to your car at all, right? They're taking care of it.
Well, you did get out of the way.
You got out of the way. You didn't, you maybe inhibited an idea that you might try fixing it yourself when you know nothing about cars. But, basically you just outsource it to someone else, just in the same way that you might outsource the mowing of your lawn to somebody. You don't want to do it. You don't even want to have a lawnmower. You just want the lawn mowed, and so someone else can do it. That's fine. That works great. But there's nothing really like that for us.
Replacement?
Replacement?
I said hip replacement.
Oh, hip replacement.
There's still a lot that has to go on within you.
Yeah,
that's
But okay, that's true. That's an external thing. And part of the recovery process from that is learning how to integrate that new part. But generally speaking, on a day-to-day basis, if you want to improve the way you function and use Alexander ideas about self-direction, for example, the complexity of what you're outsourcing is just many times the complexity of a car or any piece of machinery. And you can't really call in, I mean, you could go to a psychiatrist for certain things, you could go to a doctor for some things, a fitness coach, but really, it's kind of on you to bring about those changes. Now, one thing you could do is go to an Alexander teacher, and they will help you with this process. But even there, ultimately, it's up to you. They can teach you how to outsource from most Alexander teachers will not use this terminology, but they can teach you how your prefrontal cortex can outsource the changes you want to the rest of your body. That's how I see it. And it's just because it's so intimate and complicated and interconnected, you're really the only one who can do that. Like a teacher could come along and use their hands to help to guide you into a new head-neck relationship, for example. And you get this experience, and maybe you don't do any thinking about it at all. You're just following their hands. And that process applied over a period of time could itself lead to some improvements. But I would say ultimately, you kind of want to be in charge, right? You want to be doing this. You want to be accomplishing this yourself. I mean, I guess there's some people who just love Alexander lessons and will go for their whole life. But people, they don't have the money or the time for that.
Yes, and I agree. To me, the empowering thing is that you have capacity within you, just with how you think and pay attention, to make changes. And I want to say that the changes that can come about under an Alexander teacher's hands, if repeated enough, even if you don't do the cognitive piece, you are a whole. We just talked about that. We can't separate. There is still learning kind of going on the other way, but I think it's not as, when it's only that way, I'm getting myself in hot water here, I think.
Go for it.
But if it's only that way around and there's no cognitive self-direction piece, it's easy for something to just come in and interfere with it. It's not as likely to be as long lasting. It's not something you can purposefully, consciously bring to bear in a stressful situation, for instance, when you might especially benefit from it.
Exactly.
It
becomes, I would almost say, if what you're getting in Alexander lessons is just hands-on manipulation that improves your use at that time, and that over time carries over into the rest.
It can be very, very useful.
Very useful. But I think it's not really tapping into what Alexander was certainly interested, which was different. He just has different words to describe it, but man's supreme inheritance, for example, the title of his first book.
I mean, and what I would say is there are definitely some people that do teach without any verbal stuff.
Absolutely,
but I think that's,
there are some, yes.
but I think that's the minority of teachers. It's usually some sort of combination. You get the experience from the hands-on, and you get some cognitive guidance. I don't know.
Right.
And I guess I've gone virtually the other side, is that
right.
I'm pretty much teaching hands-free.
Well, you know, and
Mostly.
Alexander himself, there is this account that he showed up in his studio one day and announced to one and all that he had been experimenting with directions, and he said, you know, I've learned how to get it for them, for the students. And I think who knows the reasons behind that. I think part of it was that the directions he was using back then were kind of flawed directions. They were not optimal directions. Today, I think we have way, way, way better directions available. I mean, it's a quantum leap almost. And I think,
there's no doubt to me that someone could have an absolutely amazing experience under someone's hands. I've had it myself and not understood what happened. Totally, I've got no way of even bringing about a portion of it really myself, because I did not understand the process, and yet I benefited, and it was wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my first Alexander teacher, it was all that, 100%. There was no thinking process engaged. And I remember asking him once, well, I read about this thing called directions. And he said, oh, that's only for very advanced people. And I have to say, in my own teaching, when I teach people who've had lessons, I like to ask them what they've learned. You know, do you use directions, and how's that gone? Hardly anybody have I encountered who actually, many of them don't recognize the word, or they see it as something their teacher did, but not them, or they vaguely remember it, but very, very few actually.
Well, that is interesting, because I don't really use that word, but I'm teaching what we're calling directions all the time. I talk about thinking or constructive thinking.
I ask them,
conscious thinking.
What do you do when things seem to be a little off? And sometimes they'll say, well, I just book another lesson with the teacher, you know. And that's, you know, you could view that as a very sophisticated version of physical therapy, perhaps. That would be fine. And there are people for sure who are not going to be able to outsource, not going to be able to think in that way. Either they trauma or accident.
They have some sort of cognitive.
And there are just some people who really just, they're perfectly intelligent and wonderful people, but they don't have that ability. There are some people like that. But I'd say most people are able to learn how to self-direct themselves. And to me, that is a kind of an outsourcing process. And I haven't done this yet, but I'm starting to think that maybe I should explicitly use that term outsource in my teaching, because people are familiar with it, right?
Try it out and see what you notice. I'm harking back to an interview we did on the notice.
Yeah. So I would certainly be interested in any feedback on this connection that I'm seeing between inhibition and outsourcing, because I'm just beginning to play with that idea, and I don't want anyone to think that this is my definitive idea about it, but I think it's worth thinking about. And that's kind of all I've got to say. Do you have anything you want to?
Yeah, I'm not sure what I think about the idea of outsourcing, but I'll be thinking on it further too, Robert. So.
And maybe we'll do a part 2 of this at some point. Yeah, that's pretty much all I've got to say. So, and you've said everything you want to say, right? So far.
So far.
So, well, thank you so much for being on the show. My guest today has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. And thank you.